the world's largest all-remote company. And in this presentation, I'm going to unpack how to build process and documentation into your culture. I want to thank you in advance for your time and attention, and I'll do my very best to make sure this is relevant and actionable for you and your team. So who am I? I'm Darren. Now I work for a company of over 1,200 people spread across more than 65 countries with no offices whatsoever. So even our executive team is remote. And I've spent my entire career working across the spectrum of remote. I've worked in co-located spaces as well as hybrid remote companies, and now in an all-remote company. And I've learned a lot about documentation over the years and just how vital it is for seamless communication in a remote team. I'm going to share a bit about how GitLab does that, and then parlay that into how you can use some of those best practices, no matter what company or environment that you're in. So let's look at 3 challenges that I hear very often when it comes to transitioning to a remote workspace. The actual home workspace is usually a challenge if there's not a physical separation between work and life. And there's the communication side of it, and then of course, mindset. This goes to the reality that it's only part about tooling. The other part is about culture and the mentality around implementing it and trusting the team that you cannot physically see. Today, we're going to focus on that middle section, communication. So process and documentation is all wrapped into this. And I think this is really important to focus on because when a team is transitioned into remote or thrust into a work from home environment, comms are one of the first things to fail. You'll see communication silos be created. You'll see fragmentation of information where people don't know where something is happening, or projects will start in Slack and then they'll get picked up in email and so on and so forth. And without a really sound documentation strategy, communications can be a nightmare in a remote team. You may hear that documentation is really important in a remote team, and that's not wrong, but there's some danger in just advising a remote team to document. If you let everyone document in their own way, you create this kind of wild west of documentation where some people will document in Google Docs, maybe some other teams in Notion, some people just like to keep a running draft in an email. And the problem there is if you're not prescriptive about what communication happens in what channel and what the single source of truth is for team-wide documentation, you end up with these silos where no one really knows the full scope of documentation in any single repository. And so it becomes a leadership approach to being very prescriptive and removing the ambiguity on where communication happens and where the central source of truth is. So I want to take you through the why, what, who, and how on how GitLab thinks about handbook-first documentation. And the reason we call it handbook-first is because we have a handbook, a company handbook. It's public to the world, but it also serves as our central nervous system. And it's the single source of truth for all of our processes and all of our protocols. And across our 1,200 people, regardless of what continent they're in or what time zone they're currently in, they always know that the latest and greatest information is in that single source of truth. So we have a culture of self-service and self-learning where you don't even have to tap someone on the shoulder because you know you can go to the handbook, and the handbook is what's going to be most current. And we actually empower everyone in the company to make a merge request, to create a proposal, to update or change the handbook. And then it's up to the code owner or the directly responsible individual of that section to look at those merge requests, merge what is relevant, tweak what might need some tweaking, and reject what isn't relevant. So why do we do this? The biggest reason is to minimize confusion and dysfunction. And if you're a newly remote team, this should be your top priority. Stabilization should come before anything else. And there's no better way to stabilize a team than to rally around how you're going to document how the actual company functions, as well as what the values are and what the culture is. And we'll touch on that in a bit. So what do we do with this? One of the most sizable challenges when you're going remote is keeping everyone informed in an efficient way. So the what here is we document so that people know where to go, and what they'll find there is the absolute truth until it is changed and proposal is given and accepted. I mentioned this earlier, but we enable everyone in the company to contribute to documentation, and this is key. This transparency may feel a bit unusual if you're coming from a command and control co-located space. But there's great power in empowering everyone to contribute to making the handbook better. What this does is it ensures that the handbook is a living, breathing, evolving document, and everyone is invested in it. If only the executives can make changes to the handbook, and anyone else kind of feels like it's being thrown at them instead of something that they can actually contribute to. And of course, if you can contribute to something, you're more likely to use it as an actual reference point. So how do we do this? We use GitLab, the product. We use merge requests so that everyone in the company can create a request, a proposal, the keyword being request, and then assign it to the directly responsible individual. And they can take a look at it and then merge something to the handbook or edit it, ask for more feedback, so on and so forth. So we work handbook first, as in we make the change to the handbook, and then we disseminate what changed. And we communicate that out company-wide, either through an email or through Slack, depending on the size and significance of the change. So one other thing that you should think about, the mindset you should have if you really want to make documentation work, should always strive to answer with a link. So let me explain how this works in practice. If we have a new hire at GitLab and they join and someone pings me on Slack and they ask me a question, my goal is to be able to find it in the handbook, copy the link, and paste it back to them. I want to answer them with a link. This serves many purposes. It's very efficient to begin with. It lets them digest that information on their own time, and it minimizes the interruption to anyone being asked. The other thing is it pays it forward and it plugs knowledge gaps. Because if I'm able to answer with a link, imagine how many other people may have the same question, and they're also able to find the information. And not only are they able to find it quickly, but it's the exact same answer that you give to anyone else. So you don't get this watered down answer or maybe an answer that lacks context. Everyone gets the exact same answer. So by default, everyone is on the same page because they're quite literally reading the same page as the answer. And if ever you're given a link as an answer, it creates this positive flywheel where if ever you're asked a question, the order of events is answer the question, and if it's not documented, let's create a place in the handbook for this to be documented such that going forward, you can always answer with a link. So I want to walk you through an actual real life example here. So if you see here some of these speech bubbles, these are pretty common questions that you might get in an organization. How do I give a presentation? What's our mission statement? What's our vision? Do you have time to walk me through something? Who approves this? I've got a client that wants to know about something. Hey, does anybody have a slide deck or does anybody have a template? In the typical office, these kinds of questions fly around the room at rapid speed. And it's very inefficient to just answer these one-off, every single person. So we solve for that by answering it through a documentation process, a systematic approach to documentation, and then we disseminate. So at GitLab, it all begins with a merge request. And so the screenshot you see here is me actually answering some of those earlier questions. I was being asked about evangelism materials, and I wanted to be able to answer everyone in the exact same way. And I realized that this didn't exist in the handbook. It would only exist in hearsay or various Google Drive folders. And so I needed to solve for that. So I created a merge request to change the relevant portion of the handbook to actually add a section on systematically answering these questions. And I was careful to put this in the right handbook section so that you could find it if you started from scratch or if you went searching for it. So I created the merge request, which is simply a proposal to add something new or change something within a handbook section. Now, I am the code owner for that section, so I was able to merge this request, and then this is what that code looks like now that it's been merged in the handbook. Now, since it's been merged and we have a public handbook, anyone can go look at this. Anyone can go find this. Now, this particular section is more of an internal guide, but it also allows people outside of GitLab to transparently see how we're thinking through this. And these are the assets that we're giving our employees. And that transparency is really key. It's a core value at GitLab. Not every company is going to feel comfortable enough to put their entire handbook online. But there's power in transparency, even if it's just transparency within your team. Because again, this ensures that every employee knows that they're seeing the same thing as everyone else. And in a remote team, putting everyone on a level playing field when it comes to knowledge and dissemination is incredibly important in getting cohesion across the team. So why build a handbook first mentality? into your culture. The positives are numerous. To begin with, remembering stuff is really hard. And so writing it down once instead of rehashing it 100 times is just a better way to live. It will simply heighten your quality of life. It'll make your company a lot more efficient. Less meetings, paying it forward, and it actually creates a self-service approach. So you want to implement documentation such that people think to go find the answer themselves first instead of interrupting someone else's day. And this goes back to number 2. That enables people to have more time, less interrupted time for deeper work. And as your team scales and time zones become fractured, this allows people to get access to things 24/7 instead of having to waiting for someone to wake up. It's also really inclusive. So from an accessibility standpoint, something that's written down is much, much easier to translate. And it also allows people that maybe if it's not their native language, they're able to sit with it and process it. Whereas in a verbal conversation, you're usually constrained by time. It solves communication silos, it solves knowledge gaps, and it solves discoverability issues. And I would say if you don't have a handbook right now, you can stand one up relatively easily. You could use GitLab Pages, you could use Notion, you could use Ask Almanac. I would encourage you to look for one that involves continuous integration and development and merge request type features, because that empowers everyone to make a change. And that way everyone will be invested in it. And don't be daunted by the fact that you're starting from scratch. GitLab's handbook is over 5,000 pages now, but it wasn't always that way. It started as one page and writing down our values. So if you have to start somewhere, I would say do 2 things. Write down your values, write down what you believe in, write down the North Star that's going to guide every single decision you make as a business, as well as how people treat each other. And then start it as an FAQ. What are the common questions that people have? Maybe it's connecting to a VPN or getting access to certain software, or what is the expensing policy if you now need noise canceling headphones or certain ergonomic equipment to work well at home. Write these things down, give people a resource to turn to, and also create a feedback mechanism where people can document in reverse, document what their challenges are if they're struggling in this transition. You'll see common threads, and the common threads should become your prioritization list of what to fix in what order to ensure that your team acclimates and adapts well to a remote setting. And I want to close by offering up a resource that I've published within the GitLab handbook, and you can access it at allremote.info. So here you'll find our remote playbook, which is a PDF with a starter guide on emergency planning, as well as a starter kit for workers on what you need to know and the 5 things you need to implement right away if you've been thrust into a work from home environment. And then beneath that, there's a lot of deeper reading. There's over 30 guides on how GitLab thinks about everything related to remote, how we approach asynchronous workflows, how we do meetings, how we look at hiring and compensation across the globe. Everything you should need to acclimate and actually build remote into your plan, your operational strategy, your talent strategy. I know a lot of you may be trying to stabilize right now, but working through that stabilization actually lays the groundwork for something really powerful going forward. And I want to close with this. I'm actually really, really optimistic about the future of remote. I think that we're going to look forward in 6 or 12 months, and we're going to see that people have actually taken this opportunity to decouple geography and work and introspectively look at what their identity has been tied to. And if it's been tied too tightly to work, I think this is going to be a boon for communities. I think small and mid-sized cities are going to see people transition away from major urban centers to find a higher quality of life, better air quality, better schools for their children, and really invest in some of these towns where they've seen their population erode to the major urban centers, where people have moved there just because their vocation is there. I think what's going to happen in this process is that many people will break down the myth that this job can't be done remotely. Turns out a lot of digital jobs actually can be done remotely. And if companies lay the right infrastructure, people can even thrive. They'll regain that time that they've been losing to their commute. They'll spend more time with their family. They'll spend more time in their community. They can focus on things like getting good rest and exercising and cooking, hobbies that we've sort of let go to the wayside when we focus so tightly on weaving our identity to work. So I actually am very optimistic about the future. I think what happens in the next 6 months is going to be key in how remote is viewed henceforth. And anyone that's in a remote industry, we have a responsibility to show the way to those who've been thrust into this environment. So if you have any tips or suggestions, reach out to me on Twitter or make a merge request to the GitLab handbook.
We will start the thought exchange for the live Q&A here. All right, so we'll move over to Discover, and Darren, I'll hand it to you, starting with the top question.
Awesome. I will start at the top. How is the handbook, so the GitLab handbook, how is that information quality controlled, and how do you manage conflicting info submitted by different people? So the short answer is GitLab, the product, is core to our handbook being the way that it is. And the reason for this is source control and version control. So if you're attempting to use a typical wiki as a company handbook, the two issues that you'll find as you try to scale are that you can't really have a safeguard on what goes in. It's either in there or it's not. And the second thing is, because of that, most of the time, it's just the executive team that has access to it. So you basically have the executives adding to your company wiki, and then it starts to decay because not a lot of people feel invested in it. So with GitLab, by using GitLab, the product, to actually build our handbook, we actually submit a merge request to change the handbook. And this is how we control whether or not information is good or bad, because you cannot just merge something into the handbook unless you have maintainer access. You have to first submit the merge request, which is a proposal to change something in the handbook, and then you assign it to the code owner. So for example, if I wanted to propose a change in the finance section of the handbook, I'm not in the finance team. I can make the proposal, but then I have to assign it to the ultimate directly responsible individual in the finance team. And this could be a couple of people, maybe several people would have access to this, the controller, the CFO, things like that. And then they would take a look at the proposal. They could then edit the proposal. They could just merge it if it's 100% ready to go, or they could reject it, give me feedback, something like that. This version control, this source control, is vital to making the idea of a handbook work across the entire company. We empower everyone to make proposals and changes and updates to the handbook. And then we ensure that the directly responsible individuals, the code owners of different sections of the handbook, ultimately have the power to merge. So that's the short answer. And we're actually building a suddenly remote handbook for companies that want to use this. If you Google suddenly remote handbook, you'll see it. allremote.info is the shortcut to get there. We have a rudimentary version now if you want to create a GitLab account and spin up a handbook based on that. And we're working on a more polished version down the road. All right, the next question. How did you manage to keep everyone on board on maintaining the documentation and making sure there are updates to outdated information? This comes back to the culture that everyone is invested in the company handbook. And this is absolutely vital. If you only let a small portion of your company add changes to the handbook, it's unlikely that everyone is going to feel invested in it, that everyone is going to feel like that's where they should go for information. The second piece here is that the handbook is GitLab's single source of truth. So we can't actually do anything at GitLab unless we read it in the handbook. It's the single source of truth for all of our processes, protocols, for our benefits, for vacation policies. Everything is in one place, company-wide. So what happens in a lot of companies is the finance team will have a handbook and the engineering team will have a handbook, so on and so forth. But no one actually communicates between departments. So the finance team can't see what the handbook looks like, and the engineering team and HR team, et cetera. So a lot of times there's duplicative efforts. So the engineering team documents how they do an expense report, and then the HR team documents. They actually could look very different. And now you have double effort going on. So how we ensure that it is an active, living, breathing thing is we force it to be the only single source of truth. And that's really, really, really important. And for companies that have been thrust into remote, I get it. It's going to be a little bit difficult if you've kind of let people document on their own, but getting to that single source of truth is really important. All right, next question. How do you make sure that there are not multiple instances of information and ensure everyone keeps it up to date? So a little similar to the last question, but there is a key point here. Multiple instances. I actually have seen this where someone isn't sure where to add something in the handbook, so they just assume that it doesn't exist at all, and then they add a new handbook page to put information in, when instead they actually should have just updated a page that was already there. So we actually have, if we don't catch this internally, oftentimes we catch it internally just because it's updated hundreds of times a day. So somebody inevitably will see 2 copies of it, and then they'll just make sure that the one stays as the single source of truth. So in this case, you would make a merge request to remove a duplicate entry. But we actually have a handbook team. We have a static site editor team, and it is actually part of their job to make the handbook better, to innovate on it. We treat the handbook like a product, and they help set the rules on formatting and guidelines and things like that. That's something you should really look into. I know that might be difficult with a small team, but as you scale, your handbook is really, really important. And it is worth putting at least 1 or 2 people on maintaining that structure so that everyone at the company kind of knows the rules of the road of how to add information and where to look before information is added. Next question, how do you know what the right amount of information is? This is a great question. So the GitLab handbook, it's fully open source. We don't have an internal handbook and an external handbook. There's only one handbook. It's publicly accessible. If you go to allremote.info, that'll take you into the remote section of our handbook, but you can get down deep in the rabbit hole from there. If you were to print it out, it would be over 5,000 pages, which is a lot. And oftentimes people will ask me, isn't that too much information? And then to respond to that, I say, do you think the internet has too much information? Which of course the answer is no, because we know how to use Google to find the information that we need when we need it. The GitLab handbook is no different. We actually have a GitLab handbook page on how to search the GitLab handbook like a pro. Pretty meta, but as the company has scaled, we have heard that from new people coming in, like, how am I ever going to read 5,000 pages? So we have to remind people in onboarding, we don't expect you to actually read all 5,000 pages. We want to just make sure you're equipped with the right search tools to find what you need easily when you need to find it. You'll find at GitLab that we try to offload as many things as possible from humans to documentation across the company. So we want people to rely on the handbook and reduce their mental load so that they can actually use their mental load to be creative, things that only humans can do. Anything that can just be written down in documentation, we want to offload that. It frees people up to do more creative things instead of just remembering where something is. Where do I start in building a handbook where things can be missing at the beginning? So as I mentioned, if you Google Handbook-first documentation on GitLab, you will see a link there to a small rudimentary project. It's called the Suddenly Remote Handbook, where you can basically copy that repository, create a GitLab account, and start building your own handbook for free using that. And we've already laid out some of the templates that you'll need to get that done. But then there's the thought of, well, what do I write down first? I tell people, don't get overwhelmed. GitLab's handbook became 5,000 pages over years. It started as 1 page. And so even if you start with 1 page, you're in a good spot. I would start with 2 things. First is write down your values. In a remote setting, a company's culture are the values. They're one and the same. Because when you don't have an office to go into and culture isn't defined by things like decor or personas and auras in the room, the only thing you can ever go back to as the North Star is your values. So if you Google GitLab values, you'll see that we have 6 core values, but they don't stop there. You'll find thousands of words in between all of those values called sub-values that exemplify what a value looks like. How do you live a value in a remote setting? We write all of that down. That is key because any process and protocol that you would then write after needs to always map back to the values. You should never create a process or a protocol that is in misalignment with your values. So if you don't write the values down first, you have no foundation in which to build process and protocol on. The second thing is just an FAQ, especially for suddenly remote teams. The biggest problem you're going to have is people spread out everywhere now have no idea who owns what or where to look. So communication can break down really quickly. So it could start as a simple FAQ. who do you go to for an access request? If you need a password reset, if you need access to a VPN, very basic, quote unquote, simple things may not be so simple in a remote setting. So just write down who are the directly responsible individuals and start mapping out pathways for people to find answers so that there's less frustration and less dysfunction. After all this is over, and I assume this being COVID-19, where do you think remote work will be? So I shared a little bit about this in the presentation, but I actually think this is going to be seen as a pretty incredible pause, a pretty incredible awakening, and a reset button that humanity as a whole has been looking for a really long time. I think that this is actually accelerating the embrace of remote by at least 10 years. You have a lot of companies that have suddenly found themselves able to continue doing business remotely. And if you would have asked them a year ago if this were possible, they probably would have said no, or it would have taken 1 or 2 or 3 years. But because we were put in this situation, humans are incredibly adaptable. And I'm actually quite proud of humanity for how fast a lot of companies have adapted. You got to understand, companies are working remotely now in the worst of circumstances. So if you give it 6 or 12 months, when the pandemic is behind us and they've had some time to lay remote infrastructure, to lay some better hygiene around meetings and communication, some better tools, I think we're actually going to be in a pretty amazing place. It's like you wouldn't build a road just to drive on it for 3 months. And so I think people that are paving their own path on remote right now, they're not just going to stop using it in 3 or 6 months. I think it's going to massively democratize work. I think the second order of this is people will start questioning whether or not they actually need to live in a very dense urban center. If they were only there for work, they can move somewhere else and kind of invest in a smaller or mid-sized community. I actually see this longer term being a key part of the solution around reversing rural depopulation. I think this is massive. We've lost so much culture because people have just had to flock to urban centers for work. What I'm seeing now is the antidote to that. I think we're going to start to see that unwind. And longer term, I think that people are going to not soon forget how important community is. We've really tied our identities to work for a really long time, and we haven't given ourselves pause to ask how healthy is that. And I think now with people in their homes and they're able to use Zoom to connect with people that maybe they haven't connected with in a long time, maybe you're going to start filling your social quota less with after work happy hours and more with just people in your community and people in your family. I think people are still going to look for that connection, but they may look less in work communities for that and more in broader communities. And I actually think that's a very healthy thing. Next question. Do you think remote focused companies are more innovative than non-remote companies? I don't think it's necessarily dependent on remote or non-remote in terms of innovation. And here's the real reason for that. I think for the most part, companies have been remote for the better part of 10 or 20 years. Even companies are a co-located company. Well, if you have 2 offices, then those offices have been remote to each other. And if you have an executive team that ever gets on an airplane or goes to a conference and then they do any work at all on the plane or in the hotel room, well, they're working remotely. So companies have been a bit shy about calling remote for a really long time. But the truth is we've been doing virtual work for years and years. We just haven't been calling it that. So I think the language around it is going to begin to shift. All companies are going to realize that there's an element of remote to what they do, even if they have a headquarters. And I think this is a really good moment for companies to be honest with themselves and say, you know what? We probably should implement some remote first practices. We should force ourselves to have better meeting hygiene. We should be more intentional about where work communication happens and where informal communication happens, because we're starting to see the decoupling of geography and work. So even for companies that are going to maintain a headquarters, there's going to be a lot more remote happening in their business than before. I think the most innovative companies are going to be the ones that admit that, and they're vulnerable enough to admit that and use this time to build the right infrastructure so that they'll be stronger and more efficient on the other side of it. Next question. How do you work this into your onboarding so that new staff feel comfortable making changes and requests to the handbook from the very beginning? So at GitLab, you actually cannot be added onto the team page until you do it yourself. So you actually have to make a change using GitLab to merge your own face and profile into the team page. So we start you pretty early. The other thing is we utilize something called an onboarding buddy, and I actually recommend this strongly for suddenly remote companies. It may take you a little while to document enough of your processes to onboard someone in a way where most of the burden has been shifted to documentation. But the thing you can do right now is pair any new hire with a mentor, a company veteran that's been there for a while. You share one Zoom link, one Slack name, and then the new hire can ping this person. It's their onboarding buddy nonstop, 24/7, as long as they need to onboard. And it prevents the anxiety of, I don't know who to ask, I'm pinging too many people. You just set them up with one buddy, you build that rapport, and then that person connects the rest of the dots around the organization. And as part of our onboarding, we actually have the buddy ask the new hire, is there anything you would want to change about onboarding? Is there anything that you read in the documentation of onboarding that wasn't clear or you think could be better? And that is actually part of onboarding, is to take a hard introspective look at what all was consumed and what can be made better. I actually helped my onboarding buddy add a new requirement for onboarding buddies, believe it or not. She joined the company and said, I really love this documentation around onboarding, but I kind of missed the new hire orientation. And it dawned on me that we have a new Labbers channel where every week, anyone new that joins GitLab, they're all posted in one place. And I said, well, just jump in there and look at all your cohorts that joined the same week. Just throw your Zoom link in there and create an ad hoc virtual type of new hire orientation. You essentially create the virtual lobby that you would have walked around in a co-located space. And she loved it and it went really well. And so we added that now as an onboarding buddy responsibility to check in with the new hire and basically ask them, hey, do you want a more social onboarding experience? If so, let's start up start a Zoom link and get the other new Labbers in this channel. Next question, what is the typical turnaround time for a suggestion? So I'm assuming for a suggestion in the handbook. Totally depends. There's some new features that we add to GitLab the product where a merge request will be started with just a nugget of an idea, and then it'll be iterated on, and changes can go for days and days and eventually weeks before it's actually merged into production. We try to do, we think about MVCs, minimum viable change, and we really embrace iteration. So we try to move things forward in the smallest possible way instead of wrapping our arms around a massive project. So some of them can take a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Every day I see typo fixes and grammar fixes. Someone will create a merge request to add a comma. So obviously that's going to take a couple of seconds, whereas some of the product features might take a couple of weeks. Totally dependent on what you're after, but we try to make it as easy as possible for people to work handbook first. It is absolutely a challenge to continue to remind people to work handbook first. Whenever you have a new policy or a new change, we want that change to be merged into the handbook first, and then disseminate it out through Slack or email and things like that. Because remember, the handbook is the single source of truth, not what someone says in Slack. And so we have to continually work to reiterate that. We've been doing this for years, but the human default is to still say something really quickly and take the shortest or the path of least resistance. And so we try to remind ourselves as much as possible to slow down, to go fast. Slow down and document. It will provide links to make you more efficient going forward.